thing that changes the whole landscape for us is that we've been on linear television for
The world of professional wrestling was rocked to its core when an unexpected moment unfolded on Monday Night Raw. An incident so raw, so unanticipated, that it will be remembered as a turning point in Roman Reigns' career. The man who had been the undisputed tribal chief, the embodiment of dominance and control, was seen not as the confident leader he once was, but as a man on the verge of losing everything. Roman Reigns was alone, standing in his locker room, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past and the crumbling empire he had built. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension, as the camera caught him in an unguarded moment, a phone call that would change everything. This was no ordinary conversation. This was a plea, an act of desperation. Roman Reigns, in his most vulnerable state, picked up the phone and dialed a number that had not been dialed in years. It was a number that belonged to none other than Dean Ambrose, now known as Jon Moxley, the man who had walked away from WWE, burned every bridge, and forged his own path. The phone call, when it finally went through, was not filled with bravado or ego. It was the sound of a man hanging on to the last shred of his dignity, trying to mend a fractured bond that time and betrayal had shattered. Roman's usual posture, so tall and commanding, was now slumped, as though the weight of the world had descended upon his shoulders. His long hair, damp with sweat, clung to his forehead, a sign of the physical and emotional toll he had endured. He was not pacing as a warrior would before battle. No, he was pacing like a man desperate to find a lifeline, to pull himself back from the edge of the abyss that was quickly swallowing him whole. The phone rang. Each tone echoed in the silence of the locker room. When Moxley finally answered, the brief moment of silence that followed was almost unbearable. Roman, the tribal chief, whose voice had once commanded armies, now spoke in a whisper, his words laced with desperation. "We need to talk. Not as enemies, but as family." The sting of betrayal. Moxley's words hit Roman like a sucker punch, a blow to the very core of his being. The tribal chief's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the phone, his face losing its usual composed demeanor. For a moment, his once iron will seemed to crack. The bond between Roman, Seth, and Dean, the bond that had built the Shield, that had elevated them to the pinnacle of WWE, was now shattered. Moxley, the wild card of the group, had always been the unpredictable element. And now he had turned his back on Roman, on the family they once were. Roman's face darkened, a storm brewing in his eyes. He was no longer the man who stood tall in front of his family, leading the charge. He was a man stripped of his allies, struggling to hold on to the remnants of a legacy he had spent years building. The Shield was no more. Instead, Roman Reigns stood alone in that locker room, with only his regrets and the ringing words of Moxley echoing in his mind. But Roman wasn't done. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he fired back with words that dripped with the bitterness of his situation. "Then let's make this about revenge. Seth's playing with fire. It's time to burn him down." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of chaos. Moxley remained silent on the other end, taking a moment to absorb what Roman had just said. The tension was palpable. It was as if time itself had stopped in that moment. Finally, Moxley broke the silence with a chilling response. "I'll think about it, Tribal Chief." The words, delivered with icy detachment, were enough to send a shiver down Roman's spine. They weren't a yes. They weren't a number. They were a reminder of the power Moxley now held, the power to decide not just Roman's fate, but the fate of WWE itself. Roman's world comes crashing down. The phone call ended. The room fell eerily silent, as though the weight of everything that had just transpired hung in the air. Roman stood there, still holding the broken phone, as though in disbelief. He had tried to reach out. He had tried to call in his favor, but now he was left with the stark reality: he was alone. The man who once ruled WWE with an iron grip, who had commanded respect from every corner of the locker room, was now a broken shell of his former self. In a fit of frustration, Roman smashed his phone against the wall, the sound of it shattering echoing through the empty room. He was angry, not because of what Moxley had said, but because of what the conversation had revealed to him. The truth was undeniable. Roman Reigns had no one left. His empire was crumbling, and there was no one left to stand beside him. A power shift. Meanwhile, across the wrestling world, Jon Moxley was reportedly seen laughing with his colleagues in AEW after the call. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, he seemed to relish the fact that Roman Reigns, the tribal chief himself, had to reach out to him for help. It was a power shift, one that Roman was not accustomed to. For the first time in his career, Roman Reigns was the one on the outside, looking in. He was no longer the kingmaker. He was now the beggar, seeking assistance from a man he once considered family. This wasn't just a simple phone call. It was a psychological game that Roman Reigns wasn't used to playing. For years, he had been the puppet master, the one pulling the strings, controlling the narrative. But now he was the one being manipulated, his fate hanging in the balance. The rebirth of the Shield? The implications of this phone call went far beyond just a simple reunion of old friends. If Moxley were to agree to Roman's offer, it wouldn't just be the return of a brother, it would be the rebirth of something far more dangerous. The Shield, once the most dominant faction in WWE history, would be reimagined, not as a unified force, but as a chaotic, unpredictable unit, a harbinger of destruction. Seth Rollins, who had spent years building his own faction and aligning himself with rising stars like Braun Strowman, would suddenly find himself cornered by two of the most unpredictable, violent men in WWE history. Rollins, who had always been the manipulator, would now be the target, facing the wrath of the very men he had once stood alongside. The Shield would no longer be a symbol of unity. It would be a symbol of vengeance, chaos, and destruction. But even beyond the drama between Roman, Moxley, and Rollins, there was a much larger story unfolding in the shadows. Paul Heyman, who had once been Roman's greatest ally, had now turned his back on him. Heyman was building a new dynasty, one that didn't include Roman at the top. The very man who had once whispered sweet nothings into Roman's ear, who had helped him build the empire he ruled, was now plotting a future without him. Roman's last stand for Roman, this phone call wasn't just about reaching out to an old ally. It was about confronting the ghosts of his past. It was about facing the consequences of his own actions, the betrayals he had suffered, and the realization that his empire was slowly slipping through his fingers. The tribal chief was no longer the invincible force he once was. He was vulnerable, exposed, and desperately reaching for something, anything, to hold on to. But the question remained, would Moxley answer the call? Would he walk back through that curtain on Raw, standing beside Roman Reigns as the unpredictable wild card, ready to burn everything to the ground? Or would he leave Roman to drown in the chaos he had created, a victim of his own ambition? The wrestling world in turmoil. As the phone call ended and Roman stood alone in the locker room, the entire WWE universe was left to contemplate the future. This wasn't just a personal struggle for Roman Reigns. This was a war that could tear the very fabric of WWE apart. The power dynamics were shifting, and the balance of power was no longer in Roman's hands. The Shield was no longer a unified force. It was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode. Roman Reigns had built his legacy on dominance, on control, and on the bloodline. But now, as the dust settled after that fateful phone call, one thing was clear. The tribal chief was no longer the untouchable ruler. He was vulnerable, and the wrestling world had taken notice. The question on everyone's mind now was simple. What happens next? Will Jon Moxley accept the call and return to WWE? Will he stand side by side with Roman Reigns in an unpredictable alliance, ready to bring chaos to the ring once again? Or will Roman's empire crumble for good, leaving a legacy in tatters never to be repaired? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: WWE will never be the same again.